Lucky Soir, Lucky O'Toole Vegas Adventure, Book 10. Written by Deborah Coonts. Narrated by Patricia Santamasso. Chapter 1. She'll turn me to stone. Panic rooted me where I stood as I stared at my nemesis. All 4 feet and 11 inches of impeccable Frenchness, she worked her way across the room, stopping periodically, greeting people with a smile, a nod, a quick word. Yet somehow, she kept the dagger of her attention buried to the hilt between my ribs. The party in my honor whirled around me, a kaleidoscope of well-heeled French fashion and feigned disinterest. However, the woman headed my way left no doubt I was very much the American plat du jour. Chef Jean-Charles Bouclé, my perfectly presented fiancé in his bespoke tux, cultured manners, and delicious accent, pressed close, his shoulder touching mine. His favorite cologne, eau de seared beef and browned onions, wafted around him, telling me he'd been calming his nerves in the kitchen before my last-minute entrance. A single bead of sweat trickled down the side of his face. What? He'd been only half listening. Stone. One look from your mother, and I'll be a permanent fixture in this ancient ossuary. I made a sweeping gesture that included all the statuary lining the room. Tucked discreetly into individual alcoves, they lorded over the festivities. Maybe that's where all these marble figurines came from. Former guests who were found wanting. He raised an eyebrow. At least 3 of them were gifts from various kings. A bit gaudy, but one never says no to a king. Jean-Charles gave me the hint of a smile. I followed his gaze, which was locked on to the oncoming human missile. Then I leaned in and whispered, "Don't look her in the eyes." Sheathed in expensive, one-of-a-kind couture that hugged her every curve, she advanced on us with an expression worn by those intent on vanquishing their enemies. Before I looked away, I took a bit of delight in the few extra pounds that expanded the middle of what might have been an hourglass figure. And her shoes were sensible, a French fashion faux pas. Her hints of human frailty lent me courage, albeit fleeting, but enough to stiffen my backbone. Jean-Charles shook his head and finally gave me his attention. "You are making no sense. What do you mean she'll turn you to a rock?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, then ran a finger around the inside of his collar, tugging it to allow blood to get to his brain, apparently without the desired effect. Not rock, stone, like Medusa. As I braced for the imminent encounter, I let my gaze wander over the gathered throng, looking for friends in the crowded ballroom. No joy. Not a friendly, recognizable face in the lot. In fact, they all looked pinched and judgmental, with a hint of fear, making me feel like I was guest of honor at my own evisceration. Okay, overly dramatic. But the whole meeting my well-heeled, very French future in-laws had me on the verge of apoplexy. Once I did the whole I do thing, my options would be gone. How was I supposed to know if I'd picked the right one? God knew Teddie had been an epic fail. Epic. My heart still bore the scars, but it had healed. My confidence, not so much. But who was it I didn't trust exactly? Jean-Charles? Or me? Medusa? Jean-Charles angled his head and looked like he was entertaining my analogy for a moment. Then he dismissed it with a quick shake of his head. "Don't be silly," he said, but didn't sound convinced. Instead, he adjusted his bow tie and swallowed hard. The usual robin's egg blue of his eyes had turned dark and moody. Emotion pulled the skin tight over his cheekbones. Even still, with his full lips and soft brown hair curling over his collar, and that body hugged by the Italian cut of his tux, he was delish. He could be kind, sensitive, demanding, churlish, enigmatic. A dizzying array, which I currently found endlessly entertaining, but worried might wear me out. Time would tell, if I survived. Seriously, death by mother-in-law is a thing. I know it is. "You're scared too," I whispered to Jean-Charles, still unable to focus an unwavering gaze on my future mother-in-law.
"She's my mother."
Repeating the obvious was his go-to when avoiding telling me something I didn't want to hear.
"And terrified would be more apt."
I swiveled a wide-eyed look at the man I supposedly knew better than anyone. His eyes caught mine for a fraction of a second before his gaze skittered away. His smile was tight and thin.
"You and I, we share difficult mothers."
"Now you tell me!" Despite whispering, my voice held a shrill note. Jean-Charles sidestepped my accusation by focusing on a face in the crowd. Following his gaze, I found myself staring at a balding man, his sneer his only distinguishing feature. Jean-Charles looked a bit surprised and put out at seeing him. "Who is that?"
"Someone who was not invited."
"Gotta have some steel cojones to crash your mother's gig. Personally, I would not tempt death that way."
"It would have been wise to stay away."
Christophe, Jean-Charles's son, moved from clutching his father's leg to tugging on my vintage Bob Mackie gown. 5 years old, blonde curls and large baby blues like his father's. He most likely sensed our discomfort and needed reassurance. The kid was an emotional weather vane. My mother, Mona, a new mother to a set of twins, had told me that many things about dealing with children were instinctive. My disbelief had drawn a knowing smile. I hated it when Mona was right. Thankfully, it didn't happen that often. After carefully disengaging his fingers from the delicate fabric, I squatted as much as I dared in the tight sheath, then lifted him. "Oof! You've been eating too many happy-face pancakes." Christophe still fit on one hip, but he would soon outgrow that perch, and my ability to fly him there. I nuzzled his hair, which smelled of baby soap and warm memories.
"Grand-mère, she looks different,"
he whispered, one hand fisted in my hair. "A woman on the warpath," I muttered, then braced for the elbow to the ribs I knew would be coming. Jean-Charles didn't disappoint, a soft nudge of displeasure, which I ignored. Girding her loins for battle to protect her soul and sainted son, I explained to my future stepson, despite his father's glare. The hint of laughter in Jean-Charles's eyes told me I was on safe ground. The laughter dimmed when I turned on him. "I thought your mother lived on a farm and named the cows." Even with my limited functionality at the moment, I distinctly remembered that was how he'd described his mother. A charming story about his father's irritation at not being able to butcher and serve the cows, which, in the naming, had become pets. The woman advancing on us with the purpose of a bullet fired from a rifle could have killed the cows with her bare hands and thought nothing of it. My opinion, but the look on her face did little to convince me otherwise.
Jean-Charles shrugged. "The vineyard. The farm is more of a hobby. How do you say it? Their men's farm."
"Gentleman's farm?" Usually his trouble with American idioms, which I had a strong suspicion was slightly feigned for my benefit, charmed me. Today, not so much.
"Oui, this."
He seemed far too pleased with himself. I resisted the urge to wipe the smug off his face. Probably bad form at a fancy French soiree. Instead, I narrowed my eyes. Lying by omission. Was that a capital offense? Punishable by death or just slow, delicious torture? Either way, it was still a big check in the con column. Yep, I was straddling the commitment fence. Uncomfortable to say the least. And Jean-Charles's mother was just more of what I didn't need. As she drew closer, the partiers formed a circle of interest, their intensity wafting off them like cheap cologne. Activity and conversation stopped. My future mother-in-law, Madame Jeanne Marchand Bouclé, stepped into my space. I resisted the urge to step back, reestablishing my boundary. The more I traveled, the more I realized the American concept of personal space translated about as seamlessly as our humor. The English were equally amused and appalled by it, the Italians ignored it, the French invaded it, and the Asians missed the concept entirely. I held my ground, as Madame Bouclé gave me a roomy-eyed once-over. The pale bow of her mouth scrunched in only slight distaste. I took that as a win. Her brown hair, the color softened by invading gray, was cut in a stylish bob. Her gown, a golden chenille that changed hues where it wrinkled and flowed, was fitted and tasteful, yet provocative in its off-the-shoulder design. A long cocktail length, the dress exposed her ankles and the color-coordinated ballet slippers adorning her feet. My shoes were French, but my gown shouted American chutzpah, and not a little bit of Vegas showmanship, no doubt considered a bit bourgeois by this crowd. I envied the effortless style with which French women carried themselves. I also envied their figures. Of course, they didn't have to ignore the siren call of In-N-Out Burger animal style every day. Jean-Charles's mother said nothing, so I clamped my mouth shut too, thinking then it would be impossible to stuff my foot in it. We faced off, her appraisal and my fear a chasm of silence between us. Jean-Charles leaped into the breach.
"Mama, may I present Miss Lucky O'Toole?"
She flicked one stenciled eyebrow skyward and extended a hand, palm down. I hadn't a clue what to do with it. Kiss it? Not a chance.
"Mama!"
Using his exalted son status, Jean-Charles competed with the raised eyebrow thing. I could beat them both, but now was probably not the time. The crowd eased even closer. I felt certain they'd drawn a collective breath and held it. The air didn't move, hanging instead, thick and stifling with emotion. Jesus, I sighed. The dregs of my patience dried on the bottom of my empty flagon previously filled with the milk of human kindness. I took her hand in both of mine. It's a pleasure to meet you. The men in your family have been singing your praises nonstop. Thank you so much for inviting me to your lovely home and having this amazing party. I am incredibly honored. What can I say? Suck up is my best thing. A skill well honed through years in customer service at the Babylon, Las Vegas's most over-the-top strip resort. And before that, at lesser properties in the wild and woolly parts of Vegas most well-heeled folks never see. When I began life at a whorehouse in Pahrump, who knew I'd end up here, in Paris, fated by those at the upper end of the upper crust? Certainly not me. This was so far from my normal that all I could do was make it up as I went, and apparently use too many superlatives. Madame Bouclé inclined her head slightly. The room filled with expelled air. The mood brightened. The fear skittered to hide in the corners. Jean-Charles visibly relaxed, and the lady in front of me gave me a smile.
"My dear, please ignore my son's lack of manners. I've been looking forward to meeting you. You have captured my son's heart and have enraptured my grandson, both challenging tasks. I must learn how you have done such a thing."
Her English was flawless, infinitely better than my high school French, which I had yet to trot out. In this crowd, being 6 feet tall, curvy, and American was enough of an embarrassment.
"Let me introduce you to my friends."
She turned on her heel. Jean-Charles motioned for me to follow, then fell in behind me. Christophe gladly rode my hip, bobbing along high above the fray. Being tall was my cross to bear, but I figured it was infinitely better than staring at everybody's thighs. So I took pity on him, and on me, and let him ride into the fray, a human shield as it were, but he didn't need to know that. "Where's Desiree?" I tossed the words over my shoulder as I followed in Madame Bouclé's wake. Jean-Charles rested a hand on my shoulder as he leaned closer to catch my words.
"Pardon?
Your sister?" I was counting on her to be my wingman. Her absence left me flying solo. Of course, I'd been complicit in the death of her estranged husband, Adone Giovanni, who, with his mistress, had conspired to steal Desiree's business. So maybe expecting her to greet me with a bus on both cheeks might be overshooting. Frankly, I thought my assistance in taking him out of the gene pool was a good thing. But love could be super complicated. Maybe Desiree was planning to plant a dagger between my shoulder blades. To be honest, I didn't have a clue what transpired between her ears, nor what she held in her heart.
She would not miss Mother's party.
Jean-Charles made the prospect sound like doing so would mean the guillotine. Hope she's okay.
Pfft,
he puffed in French derision.
It will be a man. It is always a man.
Rather evolved of you. Your man card is in trouble. Don't you Y chromosome types always blame bad things on women?
I am not saying she is not at fault. She chooses the men.
He tugged a bit with the hand still on my shoulder.
What is this, man card?
Only thing that keeps you guys in the game. Madame Bouclé yanked my attention back to the terror at hand. I so should have brushed up on the rules of French decorum. Vaguely, I remembered something about not touching anyone, and for sure not smiling very much. The French think it makes Americans look like fools, and perhaps a bit insincere. Spot on in my book. She stopped in front of a couple waiting with expectant expressions. Tiny, perfectly turned out, they gave her a thin smile.
This is Miss Lucky O'Toole, Jean-Charles's fiancé.
I painted on what I hoped was a pleasant expression that wasn't a smile, and tried to remember my fancy manners. The names, unusual in their pronunciation, faded as one overwrote the one before on my mental hard drive. Christophe wriggled on my hip, and my arms ached from corralling his weight as a starched and unctuous liveried member of the staff hurried to Madame Bouclé's side. If the interruption bothered her, I couldn't tell. Composure was something I strove for, failed at, and consequently strongly admired. Jean-Charles's mother was impeccable. I wondered if she also had the royal wave down. As the man bent and whispered in her ear, Madame Bouclé's hand moved to her throat, her fingers intertwining with her pearls, twisting them like expensive worry beads. Her face paled, her jaw slackened, revealing her age and her worry. The man stepped back, and Madame Bouclé motioned to her son with a fluttering hand held close to her side, a subtle move not to draw attention. Jean-Charles touched my elbow with a gesture of understanding, and I relinquished his son, my arms screaming their thanks. In one fluid movement, Jean-Charles took his son, lifting him high, then dropping him on his shoulders.
What is it, maman?
It's Papa. She wilted as her knees buckled slightly. With a flawless segue, Jean-Charles caught her arm, steadying her.
He's not well. His heart.
Jean-Charles skewered the butler with an unmistakable look. The man turned on his heel and disappeared through the doorway. Jean-Charles, now holding his mother's elbow and his son, inclined his head, indicating I should follow him. I dug in my heels. I should stay here.
No.
His tone brooked no argument. This was not the place to make a scene. I could feel the heat of the partygoers' stares. Jean-Charles ushered us through a doorway hidden in the paneling of the front hall, then down a hallway with multiple intersections with other corridors. The back of the house. As a hotelier, I was familiar. As a gal from Pahrump, this was home. Worry propelled Jean-Charles. I had to hurry to keep up. At the third intersection, he turned right, then burst through swinging double doors. I followed, catching the doors on the back swing. Blinking at the light, I found myself in a cavernous, white and stainless kitchen, the workstation spotlighted by commercial-grade overhead lights. Delicious aromas wafted from ovens and bubbling pots. My stomach growled. I cringed as the family clustered around me, afraid they might have heard. But something was wrong. Jean-Charles pushed into the kitchen.
What is going on here?
He kicked at a pot rolling on the floor. Utensils were scattered on the tile like grown-up pickup sticks. A pool of something that smelled drool-worthy oozed from under a prep table.
Where's my father? Over here.
A voice, indignant but weak, answered in a timbre that held hints of his son's. Jean-Charles kicked at a pot as he hurried toward the voice. His staff remained rooted. In full French bluster, he turned and shouted at them.
Back to work! And clean this up, now!
They all jumped. Hell, Jean-Charles's imperious tone had me wanting to reach for a spatula. Instead, I followed him while the others held back. While food sizzled and steamed, they clustered together, staring at the man slouched in a chair someone had pulled into the center of the kitchen. Long, lean, all angles and anger, he pushed away a young man pressing a cloth to his head, pressing it to his head himself. When he lifted it slightly, I gasped at the long, red gash in his forehead. The man let loose a long stream of French I didn't understand, yet understood perfectly. His other hand drifted to the center of his chest, where he pushed, then winced in discomfort. From the gash or his heart, it was hard to tell. I glanced at Jean-Charles, then again at the man in the chair. The apple hadn't fallen far. Jean-Charles shifted Christophe to his hip as he knelt by his father's chair. Christophe, his eyes glistening, patted his grandfather's face. Children and their empathy. Why do we lose that as we grow?
The pain, is it bad?
Jean-Charles asked his father in a whisper. Looking at his father, I could answer that one. The man was so pale his skin held a hint of blue. His cheeks hollowed below 2 wide eyes. He panted as if running a race, perhaps against death himself. My father, with a bullet in his chest and blood leaking out so fast, had been as close to death as one could get without stepping into the afterlife. Jean-Charles's father was right there, toes curled over the edge of the abyss, his features donning a death mask as he sank into himself, his life force depleted. The man was way past not well.
Should I call the doctor?
Jean-Charles had seen the same as I had. Without waiting for permission, he nodded at his mother, who eased away to summon help.
Did you take the nitroglycerin?
He pushed his son's concerns aside.
It will go away.
With 2 fingers, Jean-Charles fished around in his father's breast pocket, extracting a small tin. With a thumb, he popped it open and extracted a tiny white pill.
Take this.
One of the kitchen staff appeared with a glass of red wine.
It is the Lafitte.
Jean-Charles nodded his thanks as he took the glass, waving it under his father's nose. As ammonia does for a fainter, the wine brought back the elder Bouclé, focusing him.
That's the 82,
he gasped, then sucked in more air.
One of the best vintages.
Another gasp, then a pull-in of air.
A rare cult wine. We set aside the case for a special day. We wanted to toast your engagement.
A gasp, a wince, then a deep breath.
With something special. And that is very special.
Jean-Charles held the glass to his father's lips.
Take a sip. See if it is aging well.
Christophe, his eyes wide with worry, clung to his father. A little nitro with your rare Bordeaux. Not a great pairing, but a terrific bribe. One that worked, as the old man did as his son insisted. Jean-Charles's mother returned. Her slight nod let her son know she'd found the doctor. I assumed he was on his way, since no one made any move to relocate the elder Bouclé.
How is it?
Jean-Charles asked, after his father had taken a few sips, savoring each of them. A touch of color returned to his cheeks. He breathed easier now, easing the force with which he pressed on his chest.
It helps. The pain is lessening. The wine?
Jean-Charles asked, as if that was what he'd meant.
How's the wine?
A smile passed between them. The father bestowed a look of love.
Not as special as you, but it is very good. Papa, what has happened?
Jean-Charles used a soft, measured tone.
Are you sure you're okay? The pain is almost gone.
His father waved his hand, a human flag of surrender. Jean-Charles had his father's hands, long and narrow, artist's hands that could concoct a variety of delights. Jean-Charles pushed his father's hand away from the cloth he held to his head.
Permit me?
A demand framed as a question, one of his best things, and most irritating. He snuck a peek under the now red cloth, then let loose a stream of low, guttural French. Madame Bouclé swooped in, snatching her grandson to her chest.
Jean-Charles!
Her offense was justified. If I were more of a lady, the bit I caught would have made me blush. One of the staff rushed to do his bidding, returning quickly with a first aid kit. Jean-Charles set to work. His hard expression brooked no argument. His father sat motionless, as if carved from stone. His hands were on his knees, his back erect, his face flushed with emotion.
"The wine,"
he gasped. His son brushed the comment aside.
"Who did this?"
He dabbed at the cut with cotton soaked in alcohol, drawing a few epithets from his father, which he ignored. A quick glance around the kitchen.
"Did you fight with someone? Who was here?"
Most of the staff turned from his question. Apparently, they knew what happens to the messenger.
"Laurent."
The word sounded like an epithet.
"Here? In our home? What did he want?"
"The wine," his father repeated.
"He wanted the wine?"
Jean-Charles closed the cut with 2 butterfly closures.
"He had a crazy story. I didn't listen. I didn't let him finish,"
his father managed, then convulsed into a fit of racking coughs that he caught with a white napkin pressed over his mouth. His skin turned an alarming shade of red.
"Uninvited in our home,"
he managed between coughs and gasps. Still a bit iffy on French protocol. I assumed from his inflection that was almost as grave a sin as disrespecting the women of the household. Maybe more.
"Easy, Papa. Slowly."
Jean-Charles helped his father take a few more sips of the Lafitte between spasms. This stress, both physical and clearly emotional, only put more pressure on a bad heart.
"Enzo did this to you?"
A hint of incredulity subtexted the question. From Jean-Charles's inflection, I took it Enzo Laurent may be scum, but he was no blackguard, and as an honorable man, he wouldn't ever do such a thing. Men came in all types and sometimes shifted from one to the other with the proper motivation. I guessed we all could. My mother often had me seriously considering homicide. I mean, the idea of 3 squares, a cot, and no Mona was almost irresistible at times. But jail would probably be incompatible with my serious authority issues, so I'd restrained myself, so far.
"No, a man. In the tunnels. I surprised him. He ran out through the kitchen. I couldn't catch him. The swine ran right by Enzo. At my shout, he tried to stop him as well. His jaw may be broken for his efforts." "What did the man in the tunnel look like?" "Young, dark hair. I never saw his face. He and Enzo tussled, and then he was gone."
"Where is Enzo?"
"I threw him out!"
The elder Bouclé seemed offended at the question that, in its asking, suggested there was another course of action.
"The wine,"
he gasped as he grabbed his son's lapel.
"What about the wine?"
Jean-Charles asked again, looking at his mother who bracketed his father on the other side. Holding his hand in one of hers while securing her grandson with the other, she eyed her son, her eyes dark with worry. Monsieur Bouclé sat up straighter, his face clearing as he stared at his son with a look of pain and disbelief.
"The wine. It is gone."
This time it was Jean-Charles's turn with the raised eyebrow trick.
"What do you mean it is gone? The cellar is full. We even transported the entire winery library from the winery to show our guests. I checked it myself last evening."
The truth in his father's stare could not be denied.
"It's all gone."
Chapter 2. Jean-Charles rocked back on his heels and sprang to his feet. As he passed by, he said,
"Come."
It wasn't an invitation. He snagged his son from his mother, then handed him to me. "It's okay, sweetie," I whispered, as the boy tucked in close, wrapping his legs around my waist and fisting a hand in my hair.
"Mother, stay with father,"
he ordered in a head-of-family tone. As I turned to follow Jean-Charles, his sister, Desiree, the one I'd been waiting for, burst into the room, making an entrance more impressive than welcome. I was the only one who smiled. Jean-Charles ground to a stop, glaring at his sister. I narrowly avoided plowing into him. All this stopping and starting was making me goofy. Or maybe it was the fact that I barely dared to breathe in my very fitted sheath. Either way, not much oxygen filtered into my brain.
I thought this was a party, not a funeral.
Desiree, resplendent in her own sparkly sheath, her matching shoes dusted with dirt, stopped in front of her mother. She reflectively bussed the air near each cheek while she kept her eyes on her father. Her mother looked happy to see her, but angry as well.
You're late.
Self-consciously, Desiree brushed down her dress and patted at her hair. A female reflex that connected us, even though a vast culture separated us. Even the French had taught their daughters that if the exterior is found pleasing, then you have a chance of being found pleasing as well. She needn't have bothered. Any daughter could read her mother's look, her displeasure lurking under the smile. A man, Jean-Charles had said. The last one in Desiree's life was dead. Could there be another so soon? She was stunning, no question. With that tiny yet lush figure, tousled curls, inviting mouth, and a hint of haughty, she was the kind of package men wouldn't be able to resist trying to unwrap, even though they knew they should. If recent history was any indication, she liked the bad boys. Another bit of personal synchronicity. This one I was even less comfortable with. Desiree brushed aside her family's disapproval, but worry doused her hint of jaunty.
What is going on? Why is everyone in here?
She hooked her thumb over her shoulder.
You do know we have a room full of guests, oui?
Everyone used English in my honor, for which I was profoundly grateful. Being a fish out of water, I was glad they didn't leave me at sea as well. Her light brown hair that matched her brother's was piled high on her head, with a few tendrils tickling her cheeks, adding softness, but unable to hide her concern.
Papa?
Tend to him. The doctor is on his way. Jean-Charles dismissed his sister with an order. He always brightens when he sees you. Spoken like a true older brother. Jean-Charles lifted his chin in my direction, then turned and disappeared down the hallway. I hurried to keep up. Where are we going? Shh. I hated being shushed. Halfway back to the party, he paused in front of a heavy wooden door on his right. My father's study. Ushering us inside, he secured the door behind us. A button in the top right-hand drawer of the massive desk released one of the beautiful burled wall panels on the side wall to swing open a few inches. A hushed rush of air ruffled my hair and raised goosebumps. What is this? Jean-Charles pushed the door open wider. The wine cellar. For some reason, I was thrilled he didn't say the dungeon. Must be some kind of special wine down here. Indeed. The wine cellar is very private. A secret of only our family. The wine is very precious. Be careful here. The steps are steep. Leaving me feeling like I'd just stepped back in time, way back in time, he bounded down the stone steps. My eyes needed time to adjust from the glare of the kitchen, so I took the steps slowly, balancing Christoph, who held tight. His hand, fisted in my hair, tugged, but I ignored it as I concentrated on placing my feet on the narrow stairs. With one hand holding him, and the other hiking my skirt to keep it from tangling with my feet, I worked my way step by step. Almost down, I tripped. Reaching out, I caught the railing. But the momentum, with Christoph's weight added to mine, was too much. My hand slipped. Christoph jerked my hair as he held tight. I bit down on a yelp, sucking air and holding it. Jean-Charles bolted up the stairs, catching me around the waist. His other hand found the railing. He held tight, using his body to block my fall. Steady? I think all three of us held our breath until conscious thought registered the danger had passed. I felt the press of someone behind me. Perhaps I heard a gasp, but something made me realize Desiree and her mother must have followed. Jean-Charles backed down a step, but still held me. You okay? I nodded. He held out his arms for his son, but Christoph held tight to me. He wrapped both arms around my neck. His breath was warm on my cheek when he said,
It's okay. I have you.
Jean-Charles caught my eye as he helped me down the last couple of steps. We both smiled, and the tension eased. Later, the could-have-beens would haunt me. Tripping and hurting myself was one thing. As my foot found the sandy floor, he let go of my waist and extended a hand. I took it, and he led me down the narrow stone tunnel. Sconces dotted the wall, providing enough light to navigate, though Jean-Charles seemed to know exactly where he was going. Who is Enzo Laurent?
Our sworn enemy.
I almost laughed. You mean like dueling pistols, 20 paces, dawn, all of that stupidity? He threw an irritated look over his shoulder.
Same emotion, but the battles today are fought differently.
Swords? Sabers? I hurried to keep up as he increased his pace.
Oh, wait. Fake news. Russian interference. Reputation assassination.
Hours of forced listening to technopop to see who screams in pain first. Pez dispensers. Swizzle sticks. Arm wrestling.
Lucky, stop. You are making this worse. We are gentlemen.
The hint of a laugh undercut the indignation.
Swizzle what? I do not know this.
The plastic things you stick in drinks to stir them.
An odd weapon.
An odd battle. You may be gentlemen, but you need to grow up. Here I was offering advice, and I had no idea what the fight was about.
Your words will not change history. We fight. It is what we do. By any means appropriate. There is a code, defined rules, boundaries, if you will. The wounds go deep. But you've made your point.
I was running short of sarcasm. Rather horrifying, to be honest. Without the shield of a clever quip, I'd have to pretend to be a grown-up. How quaint. The rules of engagement and the Geneva Convention are curious bits of arcana, so gutted they've been left as beyond resuscitation on the battlefield of life. I let him have his little bit of fantasy. Nobody played fair these days, and he was a fool to think this Enzo Laurent would be the exception. What is this place? Where are we going? The air was dank and cold and smelled of centuries long past.
A series of tunnels built centuries ago.
He dropped my hand and grabbed one of the torches from the wall. Seems more like a dungeon. Ancient screams whispered from the shadows, raising goosebumps.
Your imagination is racing with you.
Running away, I corrected reflexively. My toe connected with something hard. A bone? I shivered, still under the spell of my imaginings. The rustle of the people who followed mingled with imagined sounds of wraiths whispering past.
What?
He asked, his question gutted by distraction. My imagination is running away with me.
This is what I said.
Lost in the translation. I shook off the ghosts. I still think this place was a dungeon.
Feel the air? It is a perfect wine cellar.
His words filtered back to me on the coolness as he rounded a corner and disappeared. So, it was a dungeon. I stepped up my pace and followed him. The narrow tunnel opened into a slightly larger room. Racks upon racks lined the stone walls, all of them empty. Jean-Charles stood like stone. I recognized his look. Thinly veiled homicide. The thieves had left one bottle, which must have fallen and lay forgotten and half covered in the loose dirt on the floor. Jean-Charles bent and picked it up. A tick worked in his cheek as he brushed the dirt from the label. I shifted Christophe to my back, securing him by hooking my arms under his thighs. How much was here? He held the bottle for me to see.
It's not how much was here, but what was here.
Even though I recognized the label, I bent down to catch the year, then gave a low whistle. Chateau d'Yquem, 1996. Pricey stuff. He handed the bottle to his mother. Desiree peeked over her shoulder. When he turned back to me, his face was calmer, but the hardness remained in his eyes. He turned up the gas to the lit sconce, and the flame jumped, flickering light into the shadows.
The Chateau d'Yquem was one of the lesser bottles. We had one of the Chateau Margaux Thomas Jefferson bottles. A Chateau Lafite, 1869. My father purchased one bottle from a gentleman who had bought a triplet for over $600,000. Then there was our vineyard library collection. One bottle from each vintage ever produced.
He shrugged.
It is priceless and irreplaceable. This collection, our bottles and the others, was my father's work of a lifetime.
He turned slowly in a circle.
And now it is gone.
He leveled a gaze at me.
This could kill him.
I had nothing to say, so I squeezed his arm, then stepped aside, leaving him to wrestle with his emotions. Madame Bouclé seemed to wilt as she watched from the doorway.
The wine. All the wine.
She twisted her pearls like a tourniquet. They'd either break or she'd faint dead away. "Stay there, please," I said as I focused on the small space, taking in as many details as I could. "Jean-Charles, don't disturb any footprints." Christophe breathed in my ear but kept quiet. I pulled at his arms, loosening them. "Not quite so tight, okay? I won't drop you."
I know. You keep me safe.
His shiver echoed through me. Misplaced confidence, but I didn't argue, preferring instead to try to live up to his opinion. Jean-Charles shot me a glare, but he did as I asked, carefully placing his feet as he moved along the shelving. I worked my way around the other side, looking for anything that would give a hint as to who and how. "I take it the only exit would be back the way we came?"
Oui, yes.
He seemed irritated at his French. But they didn't carry all this wine out through the house under the noses of the family and staff, I muttered, thinking aloud as I walked slowly along the wine racks, staring at the sand. They'd been in a hurry, and from the scuffle of footprints, there had been several of them. I'd gone about a third of the way around when I saw it. Gouge marks in the sand as if someone had dragged something heavy. Desiree had shouldered in next to her mother and now watched me intently from the entrance. "Here, would you?" I lifted Christophe slightly. Desiree followed my footsteps as she walked carefully to me. I lifted the boy. "Go with your aunt, okay?" Christophe leaned into his aunt's open arms. Unburdened, I returned to the lines in the sand. They corresponded with the legs of the racks. Someone had tried to obscure one of the gouges in the sand as if attempting to cover their tracks, but the other one was clear. And no scores marred the sand for the sections on either side, just this one. I bent to look closer. Yes, someone had moved this section. I was sure of it. I tugged on one of the uprights of the rack. Built of solid wood, at first it didn't move. Then I threw a bit more of my bulk against it. An inch. Another tug. 6 inches. Jean-Charles, having noticed my efforts, joined in. Together, we moved the rack enough for me to wiggle behind it, while Jean-Charles kept tugging the rack away from the wall, inches at a time. His anger fueled him, giving him leverage I didn't have in heels. White tiers of deposits left by water seepage scored the bricks like chalk marks left by an inmate counting the days. Cool to my touch, the bricks were dry as I patted them. The mortar flaked as I ran my hand slowly over sections of the wall. Starting at the top, with my height, reaching the ceiling was easy. I worked my hands back and forth as I went down the wall to the sandy floor. Then I started on the next section. 3/4 of the way down the second section of wall, a mere 1.5 feet above the floor, I felt it. A cool whisper of air leaking through a chink in the mortar. I inched my hand back across the path traveled. Closing my eyes, I concentrated. Yes, I was right. I held my hand in the slight stream, my finger on the hole in the mortar. Movement was a challenge in the maquis. Squatting on my haunches strained the seams. With only threads to hold my dignity intact, I tried not to breathe as I angled my head to look at the section of the wall where I'd felt the air. Curious. The mortar was darker than the rest. With a fingernail, I scratched at it. Wet, it flaked off easily. The brick that had let in the air had no mortar at all holding it. With Christophe riding on her back, Desiree leaned over me like a vulture. Jean-Charles watched from the side. The brick extended just enough so I could get a decent hold on it with my fingertips. Rocking it back and forth, I worked it loose. I handed it to Jean-Charles and went to work on the next brick. Able to get my fingers behind it, I had more leverage. I pulled it loose easily. Same with the third and fourth. Working my way up, I kept glancing at Jean-Charles. If looks could kill. His face flushed crimson. The bastards. Rather clever, actually. I know. Not exactly a good strategy to defuse the homicide suffusing his scowl. But I never could resist admiring a good job, even if the goal was not so good. And this heist had been spectacular in the planning, and pretty impressive in the execution. What is back here? Another brick broke away. I haven't any idea. The catacombs? Do they come this far? Aren't they really on the south side of the river?
Yes. I don't know of any that extend this far, but Paris is a maze below the surface. In the past, whole neighborhoods would sink into the tunnel below. One of the kings financed repair of the supports, but that was a long time ago.
In the U.S., the whole city would be some sort of Superfund site to protect people from their history. Are there any maps? I wiggled another brick free.
Many, but none of them accurate, Jean-Charles said. It is forbidden to explore. The routes are very old, very dangerous. Many collapses in the tunnels. It is so easy to get lost.
This time, 2 bricks came together. I set to work on the row above to enlarge the opening. Well, someone not only got in, but they also managed to get out, and with a lot of heavy wine bottles. I find it impossible to believe no one saw them.
Perhaps
Desiree joined the game.
we must determine where they entered and exited the catacombs, or whatever tunnel this is.
And that would be impossible,
Jean-Charles announced.
We could follow their tracks,
his sister argued. Finding an accomplice would be easier. Their heads swiveled my direction as I worked on a particularly tough brick. Someone had to know exactly where all this wine was, and exactly how this chamber was walled off from the tunnel beyond. With both hands, I grasped the bricks and put my weight against this section of the wall. The wall gave way. Surprised, I landed on my ass. From the darkness beyond, a form fell through the opening. Unable to move in my tight sheath, I raised my arms. A man, dark hair, dark eyes, wicked grin, landed in my lap.
Lucky! You rather cut it close, old girl. Just a bit longer and I would have been a goner.
Chapter 3. I felt the burn of intensity as all eyes turned my direction. And just when I thought the day couldn't get much worse. Some days the bear eats you. Apparently, today was my day to be gobbled by a cliché, and to be implicated in a theft by a liar from my past. Desiree gasped, but unlike everyone else, she wasn't looking at me. Her cheeks colored.
You know this man?
The question, cloaked and haughty, came from Jean-Charles's mother and hit me right between the shoulder blades.
You know this man who stole our wine and put my husband closer to the grave?
Now I knew where Jean-Charles got his overly dramatic flair. My hands full, I blew the bangs off my forehead as I stared down at a nightmare, manifest in flesh and blood. Yes, I knew him. That fact alone made me suspect. I took my time to formulate a response. If I kill him now, I'd be doing us all a huge favor. I glanced at Jean-Charles, who looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fury. I can see innocent until proven guilty isn't a thing on this side of the pond. The protections of American jurisprudence tossed on their ass. Haven't you heard leaping to conclusions can be bad for your health? And your sex life, I thought, as I gazed at my future former fiancé. Yes, he was toast if he kept up this sort of asshattery. Surely he knew he already skated on thin ice. But cluelessness was one of the worst aspects of the curse of the Y chromosome, so as an unafflicted female, it was best not to expect too much.
Who is this man? He seems to be expecting you.
Jean-Charles asked in feigned amusement. The cold tone, a dead giveaway, made it sound like he'd caught us both naked in his bed. St. John Smythe Gordon, a Hong Kong financier, self-styled Robin Hood, and a man for whom the truth is at best a suggestion and always an inconvenience. He's also an opportunist, and right now he's taking advantage of an interesting turn of coincidence. St. John lay on his back half across my lap, his hands presumably bound behind him with the rope that circled his shoulders several turns, then trailed off toward his feet, which extended into darkness through the hole in the wall. A gag that he'd worked loose circled his neck. Oh, how I itched to tighten it like a garrote. Since I'd last seen him in Macau, he'd let his dark hair grow even longer. Now it fanned out behind his head, framing his flawless combination of Asian and Caucasian. He flashed his patented smile.
Lucky. If you would.
He moved a bit against the rope.
I've loosened it, but I could use some help.
His gaze flicked to Desiree, who had kept her position at the front of the crowd. He gave her a slight shake of the head, then rekindled his smile for my benefit.
Really? Just a few ticks longer. You do love to push a man to his breaking point.
His tone was seductively familiar. Oh, for God's sake, cut the crap. And I wouldn't loosen one of those ropes, even if you were turning blue.
Blue is not my best color.
He didn't seem put off by my vitriol. I agree. I'm thinking prison orange would enhance your coloring nicely. And, if you're nice, I'd consider loosening the rope around your hands if I could wrap it around your neck and throw it over a beam. Jean-Charles stepped between the two of us, as if I might be tempted to follow through. Please. Mr. Smythe Gordon wouldn't be worth the trouble. Besides, all I really had to do was give him enough metaphorical rope and he'd eventually hang himself, figuratively speaking. Regardless, the result would be gratifying.
I'd quit before she completely buries you.
Jean-Charles grabbed St. John by the lapels, lifting him off me.
Did you hurt my father?
His voice dropped an octave or two and held more than a little lethal.
Do I look to be in any position to hurt anyone?
St. John worked against his ropes with no success. As I said, Mr. Smythe Gordon was generally inconvenienced by the truth. Jean-Charles fisted a hand and reared back. Don't! For once my bark matched my bite. He's not worth it, and you won't get the truth out of him, at least not without pulling a few fingernails, followed by a few hours of waterboarding. And frankly, I don't have the time for all of that. Nor the stomach. But I was channeling all the badass I could muster. Madame Bouclé and her son still hung in the balance, teetering between my side and excommunication, or drawing and quartering, or tarring and feathering, or whatever they considered an appropriate substitute for banishment in these parts. Jean-Charles straightened at my verbal cattle prod. He dropped St. John, who landed in a rush of breath. I extended a hand, an invitation. Jean-Charles accepted, pulling me to my feet. After a feeble attempt to brush the sand from my behind, I realized it had found a home in the intricate beadwork of the gown.
Torture would be beneath you,
St. John said, but his voice had lost its swagger. His uncertainty made me smile. I tried for my best evil grin. Would it? I crossed my hands behind my back as I loomed over him, as close as I dared. Let's put this in context, shall we? In Macau, you were more than willing to leave me responsible for the loss of millions of dollars worth of rare watches. Now, you're using your not insignificant charm to convince my fiancé and his family that I am a partner in your petty criminal enterprise which has cost them dearly, both in real value and in emotional currency. Don't push me, St. John. I can give as well as you take. The flicker of mutual understanding lit his eyes.
What do you want?
Who did this? Who were you working for or with? Tell me, Does the name Enzo Laurent ring a bell?
Who?
The word substituted for a no.
The wine distributor?
St. John's eyes widened slightly. I'd learned to look for that tell when our paths had crossed before. If he wasn't overtly lying, he was lying by omission. If he didn't know him personally, he knew of him. Another cat-and-mouse game. Another bit of outfoxing him so he would show his hand. A game I'd won before. A stroke of luck and a good guess. Would I be as lucky this time? St. John Smythe Gordon was a man of many resources, great intellect, and the ego that came with it. An ego I'd done damage to. If I had to guess, I'd say Mr. Smythe Gordon carried a grudge behind the self-effacing bullshit. I'd bested him once. Now he was wise to my act. Surprise and his underestimation wouldn't work this time.
Lucky. Seriously, what is going on?
Jean-Charles vibrated with anger. The frustration of a fight with no one to hit. I got it.
You were supposed to free him by an appointed time?
He'd softened his tone, but he hadn't removed the barb of accusation. With his shuck and jive, St. John Smythe Gordon brought out the worst in me. Jean-Charles and his inability to leap to my defense sealed the deal. I hated games almost as much as I hated overblown egos. I wondered if the French, by birthright, qualified. Of course not. His presence here is a curious coincidence which he's spinning in his favor. A classic technique. The magician who throws down a smoke bomb then disappears while the audience's attention is focused on the smoke. He seemed unappreciative of the analogy, which I thought was one of my better ones. Tough crowd.
How do you know him?
We'd been through that. I don't know him. We crossed swords in Macau, as I said. He kidnapped Romeo, then thought he'd get the drop on me and leave me holding the bag.
Such vitriol,
St. John tisked. If I could have slapped him without relinquishing the upper hand, I would have.
I gave Romeo back to you.
He acted like that was deserving of lifetime allegiance. After you used him as bait to lure me into China illegally, and not to gloss over the fact you took him in the first place. I clamped my mouth shut and held up my hand. Smoke and mirrors, I am not going to argue facts. You would have been more than happy to leave me taking the fall for those watches. Jean-Charles looked at St. John in a new light, although exactly what light remained a bit murky. When he looked back at me, his expression remained a bit too conflicted for my taste. Where was my knight in shining armor, the man who would defend my honor to the death?
You didn't tell me someone stole all those watches.
They didn't. Specifically, he didn't. Romeo and I pulled a switch. I nudged St. John with my foot. Are you back for revenge?
Well, if I am, I'm making a mess of it now, aren't I?
At least you're consistent. Your kidnapping skills are pretty stellar, but your B and E could use some refining. His smile lost some wattage as I bent to grab his elbow. He scrambled out of the hole as I tugged him to his feet. The rope secured his hands behind his back, as I suspected, then made a turn around his neck, then a couple of turns around his chest before snaking down to capture his ankles, binding them together. He could stand, but only if he bent at the waist. If he stood tall, the rope would tighten, cutting off his air. He looked disheveled, dirty, and more than a little uncomfortable, which was fine by me. Perfect, actually. Where does the hole lead? I thought about poking my head in for a look, but then figured he'd put a shoulder to my ass and push me through, so I resisted.
I believe to a part of the sewer system.
Lovely. Well, at least one of my decisions this evening had been a good one. I was happy to have resisted diving through that hole. The tux is a rather odd choice, all things considered. I'm sure your little gathering was an invitation-only affair. So who crashed the party? You?
I don't know what you mean.
He tried for jaunty, but missed by a mile as he shot a veiled glance at Desiree. Someone blew your cover. That's the only explanation. Well, the only reasonable explanation as to how you came to be trussed up like a turkey at the holidays. He cocked his head.
What's the other explanation?
That your friends used your pretty boy with country club manners act, then threw you over like last week's girlfriend. Now that I think about it, that one sounds pretty good. Cute. His smile dimmed. Nothing like running out of ammo to take the fun out of the verbal skirmishing. And his down-in-the-mouth act told me all I needed to know. Well, almost. It told me his role, but it didn't confirm which team he played for.
The ropes. Would you? I can't feel my hands.
He gave me a petulant look that I'm sure had melted lesser women. Not a chance. Not until you tell me how you arrived at this point. Dressed like a prince, but trussed up and bricked behind a wall like a common criminal. Well, an uncommon criminal, but I wasn't going to give him even that.
Please, he huffed. I'm anything but common.
Opinions differ, but you clearly ran afoul of someone with a serious Edgar Allan Poe fetish.
Lucky, he can't feel his hands,
Desiree whispered. I ignored her. Too many looks had passed between the two of them. St. John had roped her in somehow, and I really didn't want to face the prospect now. If a woman made bad choices when it came to males, was she doomed to repeat that mistake over and over? St. John gave the gathered throng a once-over. I marveled at how he could look haughty and resplendent, covered in dust and with his hands and feet tied. He paused when he saw the bottle Jean-Charles's mother held.
May I see that?
Looking like she'd rather hit him with it than hand it to him, Madame Bouclé gave the bottle to her daughter, who, in turn, passed it to me. I shielded the bottle. What is it? I don't know why I asked. Maybe I wished he could give me something, anything, that would let me believe him. Like I'd said, an accomplice who I could turn to the side of good would be a massive help in getting the wine back and getting my life back on track.
Chateau de Kim, 1996. I left it here.
I held the bottle where he could see it. Why?
Things were going south. I knew if I didn't make it out alive, at least with that bottle, maybe someone would start asking questions.
Why?
It's a fake.
A murmur rippled through the crowd behind me.
It most certainly is not.
The accusation ruffled Jean-Charles's French feathers.
You don't believe me? Look closely.
The printing wasn't quite right, but only someone familiar with such a bottle would notice, and the label showed signs of quick dousing in coffee or something to try to age it. A bit of the original cream color showed through. A fake. A careless one at that. Quick and dirty. Nothing about this passed the smell test, and my gut was clanging a warning bell, big time. But who was the bad guy here? St. John was a self-styled Robin Hood, employing less than savory tactics for a noble end. But what was the end game? I stuck my nose in St. John's face. Tell me what's going on. Asking him to give it to me straight would be a waste of energy and emotion. He'd spin it so it came out smelling like a rose. My job would be to separate the truth from the bald-ass lies. Oh, and find the wine. Preferably before my future father-in-law expired and my life imploded. St. John took a moment as he surveyed his audience, no doubt reaching for just the right note that would be music to their ears.
Recently, a wine counterfeiting ring came to light. The perpetrators followed a similar pattern to this heist. They identify a worthy target, priceless wine that the owners have talked about and put on display.
So they know the exact makeup of the collection, I said, stealing his thunder and stating what I considered to be obvious. This one was hard to stomach, but easy to follow, and his stringing me along pissed me off. Not hard to do, actually, hardwired as I was.
Precisely. Then they create a counterfeit collection and replace the originals with the fakes. Many times it takes months, even years, before the collectors discover they've been swindled. They target collections to be admired, but not necessarily opened and enjoyed.
I eyed him, looking for a tick, a hint of nervousness, a tell that would highlight a lie, but I saw nothing.
3 of them have been in France, Bordeaux, actually. 3 of the premier crew houses. This is the 4th. I've heard nothing of any thefts, Jean-Charles huffed. The wine world is small, especially at the top. Would you want your competitors to know of this theft? St. John asked, his smile indicating he already knew the answer. No. Jean-Charles didn't say any more, but the red in his face stayed. Why didn't they replace this collection with fakes? I lifted the bottle of Chateau de Chem I still held. They clearly came prepared. Yes, but someone must have blown my cover. They got spooked. And this bottle? Things were not going my way. He flashed a grin. I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe someone might find it. And do what? He shrugged. Keep looking? Plausible. I narrowed my eyes, as if looking at him through slits would disclose an aura of untruth or something. Nothing. He looked delicious like he always did. Lies and truth, deception and straight shooting, all looked the same on him. Damn. I could see his captive audience was buying his bullshit. You really should think about giving up a life of crime. You're not very good at it. Somehow, I'm okay with that. St. John's soul didn't run as black as he'd like us all to believe. Not that he didn't suffer from a serious Robin Hood complex. One of his eyes was swelling. The bad guys didn't much care for your extracurricular activity, did they? That's going to be quite a shiner. Hard to blame them. To guys like that, the world is pretty black and white. So says the man who makes a living in the gray areas. Did you know any of them? Could you ID them? No, they were very careful. He shifted from foot to foot. From nerves or pain, it was hard to tell. What did they need from you? Charm. He flashed a bit for our benefit. With a growl, Jean-Charles advanced on St. John. How dare you! I grabbed his elbow and held him back. In his anger, he missed the look of relief that washed over his sister's face. Stand in line, my love. We'll have our shot. I resumed my grilling of St. John, who had not yet shown even a sheen of sweat. Charm. That's a good one. Maybe you'd be a good front man. But I don't think that's the angle you've taken in all of this. Care to enlighten me as to your real role? I can help you, or not. Up to you. I need a bit of quid pro quo. Undercover investigator. He didn't even choke on the words. I almost did, though. Really? You expect me to believe that after the egg you laid with the local authorities, the Chinese government, and the FBI? You're telling me you have now seen the light, turned over a new leaf, and any other applicable cliché that doesn't spring readily to mind? My eyes went all slitty. Seriously? You expect me to believe you've gone legit? He made unwavering eye contact. I have full backing. A tap dance worthy of Fred Astaire. Impressive. Of the Hong Kong police? The FBI? The CIA? The Mossad? His stare shifted to something over my shoulder. A very powerful man. I couldn't stifle an exaggerated eye roll. You're a mercenary, hired to recover a stolen collection. Not his normal gig, but stepping out on the slippery slope with a bit of larceny, it wasn't hard to fall all the way. St. John was best at operating under the color of the law, but running just outside of it. His slipping more toward greed would be a fall from grace, if you will. And for some reason, I believed St. John to be a man of principle, much like the wise guys of mob days long past. Kill your competition, but their families were off limits. Like I said, this whole gambit stunk to high heaven and was oddly disappointing. One had to care to be disappointed. Is he on our side? Desiree asked. I didn't know we had a side. As long as it benefits him. St. John looked wounded at my assessment, but he didn't quibble. So, who were these folks and why, this time, did they not replace the wine but decided instead to flee? St. John slowly turned and gave Desiree the fullness of his undivided attention. You should ask her. Everything stopped. No one breathed. Even the air itself seemed to hang motionless. Then Jean-Charles muttered a string of epithets.
I leaned into him. I call and raise. I turned back to St. John, the fun gone from the repartee. Explain. I can explain, Jean-Charles said through gritted teeth as he whirled on his sister. It was Victor, wasn't it? I saw him at the party. Desiree, pale, her eyes wide and glistening, stood tall under the assault.
Oui. She squirmed. He broke it off with me. Then, as I arrived tonight, I saw him leaving. I didn't invite him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Angry, hurt, intending to do what, I don't know. I followed him.
Who is Victor? I asked. One of the dogs sniffing after my sister.
Jean-Charles, his mother admonished. Please, not tonight.
So, they'd had a difference of opinion about Victor? Older brother protectionism or something else? You knew him as well? I asked Jean-Charles.
No. We had words one day at the winery. I caught him spying around in areas he wasn't allowed. After that, he stayed out of my way.
Where was he? The light dawned as my intended's eyes widened.
In the restricted area.
What was he doing there? I assume he didn't tell you he was casing the collection.
We keep the wine in a special room. Only invited guests are allowed in. He was not in there. He was in the office that is adjacent to the lab. He was looking for trade secrets.
He tell you that?
Of course not. He said he was lost and looking for Desiree.
Although not very good at leaping to my defense, Jean-Charles sure showed a talent for jumping to conclusions. You followed Victor from the party? I asked Desiree. She nodded. To the entrance to whatever tunnel lies through that hole? I asked. She started to waffle, then noticed my pointed stare at her shoes, still covered with fine sand. Of course, she had an excuse now. The sand she currently stood in most likely matched the sand she'd found at the other entrance. I held up my finger to silence the answer I saw forming. Has anyone called the police? Commissaire Emma Moreau was not what I was expecting. Of course, my expectations had been obliterated the minute the wine disappeared and the thieves left St. John Smythe Gordon as a calling card. Madame Bouclé, carrying her grandson with her, left to check on her husband. Desiree, Jean-Charles, and I worked to avoid each other as we surrounded St. John, still trussed up and trying to maintain a James Bond level of composure in light of his predicament. The commissaire, stylish in her slacks, white shirt, and Hermès scarf knotted around her neck, breezed in, breathed an introduction, no flash of the badge needed apparently, then greeted Jean-Charles warmly.
Jean-Charles.
He took her hands and kissed her on each cheek, slowly and with intention.
Emma, thank you for coming.
Still holding one of her hands, he swept an arm my direction.
Miss Lucky O'Toole from America. My fiancé.
The commissaire raised a perfectly arched eyebrow above a startling blue eye and nodded in my direction. The other eye was brown. Odd, that. But her alabaster skin and so black it almost looked blue hair added enough perfection to make the color difference exotic rather than a curiosity. Apparently, capturing all of me in a quick once-over, she turned to give a bear hug to Desiree.
What is this? The wine is missing?
She said in flawless, impeccably accented English.
And Enzo?
A look passed between them, riding on an understood history, a history I'd need to delve into at an appropriate time. Are you here in your official capacity? I asked, doubting the affection was a by-the-book police procedure, even in France. Yes, my deductive powers are impressive.
Of course. Our families have known each other for many years.
There was more there in her thinly veiled, smoldering glance at Jean-Charles, and Enzo Laurent made a nice little threesome. Great. I was the odd man out before the game even started. Cooperation from the local constabulary would be grudging at best. What else was new? I needed an ace up my sleeve, like Detective Romeo back home. I'd have to work on that. I see. Well, friendship or no, don't there need to be a couple of lawyers here before you question Desiree or Mr. Smythe Gordon? As an American, I practically had the Fifth Amendment tattooed on a hidden body part, available for easy reference. Commissaire Moreau gave me a fleeting smile.
We don't do that here. In France, one must tell the truth, even if you are guilty.
A totally foreign concept. The truth? That would never fly in the U.S.
No.
There was so much more than a tad bit of disdain stuffed in the single syllable that I chose to ignore it. Now was not the time to dissemble the merits and shortfalls of the Napoleonic Code versus the American English common law approach to justice. Unfortunately, the American way often ran right over the truth and left it for dead. Gamesmanship rather than justice. One huge life-altering sideshow. So much broken, and no one with any idea how to fix it. As they said in Vegas, the fix was in. There and, from the looks of it, here also. So much they all knew. So much they weren't saying as they went through the motions. How could they be so sure someone told the truth if nobody knew what it was? The only way to get truth out of Jean-Charles would be to get him alone where he wasn't playing to his hometown reputation. I stepped back to watch and to learn. Hard to win at a game if you didn't know the rules. Good thing I was a quick study. If I'd learned anything from my years in Vegas, it was sleight of hand, how to recognize it, and how to employ it. St. John remained against the wall where we had propped him. He wore a half grin as he shared my amusement at the show. For a man bound, but unfortunately not gagged, and looking like a primo suspect in more than a few felonies, if they called them that here, he looked remarkably at ease, and I had no doubt he was also absorbing the rules. But he would be working on ways to tap dance through the loopholes, while I was bound and shackled by a need to stay out of prison. With my authority issue, I didn't do well in enclosed spaces where someone else made the rules. Truth be told, I hated rules, but they held back anarchy most days. And despite assumptions to the contrary, the Gaming Commission was reluctant to grant gaming licenses to anyone other than a rule follower. And without a gaming license, I wouldn't have a job. And without a job, I'd just be Jean-Charles's wife, with no way to be me. And there it was. Shit. I so needed to get over myself. I refocused. Yeah, the fix was in for sure. St. John acted like he held all the cards. I couldn't wait until he turned them over for all to see. The commissaire now turned her attention to him, taking in all the details both as a commissaire and a female. Appreciation for his obvious attributes pinkened her cheeks. Great. The stink of sexual attraction permeated the small space. Rational thought and logical investigation were doomed, at least where St. John Smythe Gordon was concerned. Of course, to expect any different would have been stupid, even for me. But seriously, could this go any better? Everybody here knew a whole lot of backstory I wasn't privy to. St. John smirked like a poor poker player with a trump card. A fortune of wine had disappeared, and the commissaire should recuse herself as too close to the investigation, but she clearly had no intention to do so. And I was the kid with her nose pressed to the glass, looking, salivating, but not allowed in. And I was okay with that. I took a moment to process that. Problems that needed solving, problems that involved someone I cared about, and the need to find the solution and save the day for truth, justice, and the American way didn't poke or prod me. I felt nothing. No irresistible urge to fling myself off a cliff. No need to take up a sword and slay the dragons of evil. I wanted a drink and bed. Whoa, was I sick? What had happened to the me I used to be? Maybe I'd shed that skin like a snake that had grown too large. Interesting metaphor. I didn't try to overanalyze, and I didn't panic at the new me. I'm very tired. May I go to the hotel now? I felt like a kid asking for a hall pass.
Not yet.
Commissaire Moreau pulled out a pad and produced a pencil from somewhere, which he held poised over a notepad.
Who goes first?
Desiree volunteered.
I will tell you about Victor. Victor Martin. I met him at the winery. He worked for one of the local négociants. The last time I was there, he came by asking if we would have any excess grapes to sell after the harvest.
You sell the excess grapes from your vineyards? That would be like Patek Enzo discounting watches they don't sell at full price. And they never do that. Instead, they destroy them all, a fact that still stopped my heart when I thought about it.
No, of course not.
She gave one of the patented French bouffes, with a puff of air and roll of the eyes, in case I hadn't gotten the message that what I had just suggested was beyond ignorant. She'd have to do better than put me off the chase. If he worked for the local crusher, shouldn't he have known that? Desiree shrugged, as if to say, men.
I told him we did not sell any grapes. The next day, he came back. He was charming, disarming. We struck up a friendship.
The commissaire finished her notes, then looked up.
Did you tell him about this wine cellar? About the party?
The party, yes. The wine cellar?
Her delicate features crumpled with thought.
No, we don't talk about it. It's a curiosity, but not one that is well known.
Well, he'd invited himself to the party. I wondered if that invitation also extended to the wine. Who did he say he worked for?
Paul Bay. They are just down the road from our main vineyard in Bordeaux. They make very good wine under their own label.
They should.
Now it was Jean-Charles's turn to get huffy.
Good grapes make good wine. And the local grapes are the best. The terroir is unparalleled.
Funny. Recent studies have proven that is a bunch of hooey. The ladies of the family gasped. Jean-Charles turned a color of purple I'd not seen before. St. John laughed. I didn't care. Had Desiree been the rube, the one they used and tossed aside? Not beyond belief. While she and I suffered from the same disease when it came to men, I'd never known her to lie, only to make abysmal choices. Too trusting by far. Was there an antidote for that, other than cynicism? How did one remain a skeptic without becoming a cynic? Like a drunk negotiating a sobriety test, I'd never managed to walk that fine line. Anyway, if she didn't tell him, how had the information become common criminal knowledge? An inside job, it had to be. But who was the insider? How do you know Mr. Smythe Gordon? I pushed myself off the wall I'd been holding up and inserted myself into the conversation.
What makes you think we know each other?
St. John leaped to Desiree's defense a bit too quickly. He noticed his mistake and tempered his response.
We are not acquainted.
I asked Desiree. I turned to my future sister-in-law. Fish or cut bait time? She gave me a blank look. Sorry. Is he worth jail time? Her moxie wilted.
We met. Once.
Recently? She nodded.
At a party. The wine, it flowed freely. I don't remember much, but I remember him.
I bet. Do you remember what you talked about? A delicate shoulder rose, then fell.
Wine, of course.
Details, the commissaire asked. Desiree shook her head. Okay, you met him at the party, I said, keeping the questioning on track. When did you see him next?
Tonight.
She gave him a steady look. Where?
He stopped me when I was following Victor. He told me to get away, to go back to the party. He'd take care of it.
I bet. My inner snark was getting repetitive. What did you do?
I came back here and found everyone in the kitchen.
You gave up that easily?
Really lucky. What was I going to do? I was in a ball gown, chasing after some man I hardly knew. There would be a better time and place.
That was it? Commissaire Moreau asked, saving me from a very difficult question.
You had no knowledge of what Victor was doing? What Mr. Smythe Gordon had in mind?
Desiree crossed her arms, hugging herself.
You have to believe me. I didn't tell anyone. I had no idea.
Her voice rose in a desperate plea.
Then how did they know the wine would be here? Commissaire Moreau pushed. "I know your family. They do not share that kind of information."
I don't know.
Desiree crumpled in defeat. I believed her. From the looks of Jean-Charles's face, and even the commissaire's, we all believed her. We just couldn't prove her innocence. I whirled on St. John. "Aren't you going to ride to the lady's rescue?"
"I have nothing to add to her story. I don't recall speaking with her at any party recently. I've been following these thieves across the continent since I first caught wind of them in Hong Kong. But,"
he paused for effect, as all eyes turned hope on him,
"I do have a photo of Victor Martin."
"Why?" I eyed him, not wanting history to hold together.
"He caught my attention."
"Part of the group who departed with the wine and left you holding the bag." The divine justice of it all made me all warm inside. Normally, setting someone up as the fall guy was St. John's MO. "Text it to me?" With the ropes binding his arms, he gave me a pleading look. This was a guy who would make a mile out of a millimeter. "Which pocket?"
"Inside jacket."
He watched me with those eyes as I stepped closer and burrowed a hand in next to his chest. The corner of his mouth lifted as my skin brushed against his with only a thin shirt between. Far from a playful mood, I ignored him, which was hard to do. I found his phone. "Password?"
"Lucky."
"What?"
"That is the word. Lucky."
He hadn't forgotten I'd bested him. Instead, he'd kept me as a constant reminder. No, we weren't friends. Enemies and perhaps grudging allies, but only when it suited us. I tapped in the letters. He hadn't been joking. I held the phone so he could see as I scrolled through the photos.
"That one there."
A grainy image of a man turning to look over his shoulder where the camera caught him. The date stamp indicated tonight, a few hours earlier. I forwarded it to myself, then caught the commissaire's eye. I raised my eyebrow in question.
"Please."
She extended her card.
"My email is there."
I took a moment to scroll through the rest of the recent photos. Nothing of interest in the few he'd left on the camera. Emma held out her hand for the phone. I redeposited it in St. John's pocket. I could rifle through his belongings, but without more, the police's hands were tied, at least in the U.S. Cultivating the friendship of criminals and the enmity of the constabulary probably wasn't wise, but I had lines I wouldn't cross. And I'd learned it could be very bad for my future freedom to assume the good guys were good and the bad guys bad. I glanced up into St. John's blue eyes. "And how were you put onto them exactly?" I asked, knowing I wouldn't get the truth, or at least not all of it, but only something that sounded like it.
"My employer. His wine was replaced. An inside job. One of the kitchen staff, identified as Jai Ling Ping. Through him, I was able to track them, although they did give me the slip in Jaipur. I picked up their trail again here in Paris."
"How?"
"If you recall, I have a great many resources at my disposal. Let's just say some information as to Mr. Ping's whereabouts came to my attention."
Two uniformed officers stuck their heads through the doorway.
"Ah, there you are, commissaire. Forensics is here." "Very well. Would you take Miss Bouclay and Mr. Smythe Gordon back for further questioning, please?"
"Emma!"
Desiree sounded desperate.
"I have to. I'm sorry."
Commissaire Moreau looked to Jean-Charles, who gave her a nod, indicating his understanding, if not his happiness.
"Come."
She extended an arm to herd us all toward the opening.
"Step carefully, but let's leave this to the experts."
I positioned myself behind Desiree, with Jean-Charles and the commissaire trailing a bit behind as we trooped back through the hallway and up the stairs. Jean-Charles and the commissaire engaged in hushed conversation, fell a bit back, and I seized my opening. I leaned forward. "Where is the entrance to the tunnel?" I hissed, hoping only Desiree could hear. "What?" She started to turn. "Don't turn around. Tell me where you last saw Victor. I can help you, but you have to trust me. We've been through this drill before. Reminding her of Adonais and his demise could cut either way, but it was the only card I had, so I played it.
The metro. There is a door. Look for the Picasso, but watch your back.